quiet place is all they had left to build. Please, mister. Just a corner of the barn for the boy. The wind tore the words from her mouth and flung them into the gray expanse of the plains. A desperate plea swallowed by the immense, indifferent sky. A long silence followed, filled only by the howl of the wind and the shudder of the child huddled against her leg. It was a silence that held the weight of 100 refusals, 1,000 miles of dust, and the last frayed thread of hope. This place, this man, was the end of a long and broken road. The man on the porch did not move. Jedediah watched the woman from the fortress of his solitude, his face a mask carved from prairie wood and hardship. He saw the exhaustion that settled deep in her bones, the fierce, protective curl of her body around the small boy, and the tremor in her hand that clutched a thin, ragged shawl. He saw the dust caked on her worn dress and the hollows beneath her eyes. He saw a reflection of a world that had taken everything from him, now come to his door asking for what little remained. His first instinct, honed by years of isolation, was to say no. The word was a stone in his throat. He had no room for the living, not when his house was so full of ghosts. He had built these walls to keep the world out, to keep his grief contained. But the boy, no older than 5, looked up then, his face pale and smudged with dirt, his eyes wide with a fear that knew no words. And in that child's gaze, Jedediah saw a ghost he could not turn away. He saw a different boy, a different storm. He saw a debt he could never repay. He gave a short, sharp nod, the only answer he could muster against the tide of memory that threatened to pull him under. He didn't point to the barn. Instead, he stepped back from the doorway, holding the heavy wooden door open against the insistent wind. The gesture was stark, an invitation into the warmth that was as unexpected as a spring in the dead of winter. The woman, Ilara, hesitated, her suspicion a shield she had learned to carry. Kindness was a currency she no longer possessed, and she searched his face for the price. She found nothing but a profound weariness that matched her own. For the boy, she reminded herself. For Samuel. She took a breath that felt like swallowing dust and sand, and guided her son over the threshold. The door closed behind them with a solid, final thud. To shut out the wind. To shut out the world. Inside, the cabin was spare and fiercely clean. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, its light dancing on the rough-hewn wooden walls and the simple, sturdy furniture. It was a space built for one, a place where silence had settled into the very grain of the wood. Jedediah gestured toward the fire, then moved to the large pot that simmered over the flames, the smell of rabbit stew filling the small room. He ladled a portion into 2 tin bowls without a word, his movements economical and precise. He placed the bowls on the small table, along with 2 spoons and a loaf of dark bread. The offering was plain, but to Ilara and Samuel, it was a feast. Samuel ate with a ravenous hunger that twisted his mother's heart, his small hands clutching the spoon as if it might be snatched away. Ilara ate slowly, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail, every shadow. The cabin was one large room with a small, curtained-off alcove at the far end. He pointed to it. "You can take the bed," he said, his voice rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "I'll stay by the fire." Ilara looked into the alcove. A simple cot was pushed against the wall, covered with a thick wool blanket. Beside it, stark in the firelight, sat a small wooden rocking chair. It was child-sized, its wood worn smooth in places, but it was still. It looked as though it hadn't been used in a very long time. A chill that had nothing to do with the wind outside passed through her. She understood, then, that this man's silence was not born of cruelty, but of a sorrow as vast and empty as the plains. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. She led Samuel to the cot, pulled off his worn-out shoes, and tucked him under the heavy blanket. He was asleep before she could hum the first note of a lullaby. She sat on the edge of the cot for a long time, watching the rise and fall of her son's chest, listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin. The man, Jedediah, had settled into a chair by the fire, his back to her, a silent, unmoving sentinel. She did not trust him. She did not trust his kindness. But for the first time in months, she felt the biting edge of her fear recede, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. She lay down beside her son, fully clothed, and fell into a dreamless sleep, the sound of a crackling fire a strange and forgotten comfort. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Jedediah would rise before the sun, his movements quiet as he stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil. He would leave a bucket of fresh milk and a stack of firewood on the porch before heading out to the barn to tend his few cattle and horses. He worked from dawn until dusk, a solitary figure moving against the vast, empty landscape. His work was his prayer, his penance, his reason for drawing breath each day. He did not speak to the woman and the boy who now inhabited his home, but he was aware of them in every moment. He heard the soft murmur of her voice as she spoke to her son, the quiet scrape of a chair, the gentle splash of water as she washed their few clothes in a basin. He saw the small changes she made to his stark world. A jar of wildflowers on the table, the worn blanket on the cot, mended with neat, almost invisible stitches. The floor swept cleaner than he ever bothered to keep it. She was a ghost of a different sort, a quiet presence that was slowly, imperceptibly, breathing life back into the empty spaces of his home. Alara, for her part, moved through the days with a caution that bordered on reverence. She treated the cabin as a borrowed, sacred space. She cooked and cleaned, mended and washed, earning their keep in the only ways she knew how. She took the supplies he left, flour, beans, salted meat, and stretched them into nourishing meals, always ensuring Samuel had the largest portion. She learned the man's habits from a distance. She saw the way he would pause at the fence line and stare out at the horizon, his shoulders slumped with a weight she could only guess at. She saw the way his hands, though calloused and rough, were gentle with his animals. She saw him one afternoon, standing by the small and used rocking chair, his hand resting on its curved back, his expression so full of a distant, piercing pain that she had to turn away, feeling as though she had trespassed on holy ground. Samuel was the bridge between their two islands of silence. At first, he stayed close to his mother, a small shadow at her heels. But the resilience of childhood is a powerful force. The fear in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a tentative curiosity. He started to explore the cabin, his small fingers tracing the patterns in the wooden table. He would sit on the floor by the hearth, watching the flames, humming softly to himself. One morning, Jedediah came in from the barn to find the boy sitting on the porch step, carefully lining up small stones in a row. He stopped, watching the child's intense concentration. Samuel looked up, his expression wary. Jedediah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smoothly carved piece of wood, a rough approximation of a horse. He held it out. The boy stared at the offering, then at the man's face, before slowly reaching out and taking it. He didn't say thank you. He just clutched the small wooden horse to his chest and scurried back inside to his mother. But later that day, Alara saw him playing with it by the fire, whispering stories to his new, silent friend. It was a beginning, a small crack in the wall of silence that separated them. A routine, once established, can become a kind of comfort, a bulwark against the chaos of memory and fear. Each morning, Jedediah would find the coffee pot warm and a plate with a piece of bread left for him on the table. Each evening, he would return to the smell of stew or baking bread, a warmth that had been absent from his home for so long he had forgotten its existence. They rarely spoke more than a few necessary words. The north fence needs mending. We're low on flour. It looks like rain. Their communication happened in the spaces between words, in the language of gesture and provision. He left a bolt of sturdy calico fabric on the porch one morning. A few days later, Samuel was wearing a new, neatly sewn shirt. He noticed her shawl was thin and threadbare. His own heavy wool coat appeared on a peg inside the door, and stayed there, an unspoken offering against the increasingly cold nights. She never wore it, but she never moved it either. It hung there as a silent testament to a kindness she still didn't fully understand. One afternoon, while cleaning, Alara found a small, locked chest tucked away under Jedediah's cot. She ran her hand over the dusty lid, her curiosity warring with her deep-seated respect for his privacy. She left it alone, but the image of it stayed with her. It felt like the heart of the house, the core of the man's sorrow, locked away from the world. She saw him sometimes in the quiet moments after supper. His eyes would drift toward the chest, and a shadow would pass over his face, so profound it seemed to dim the firelight. She knew then that his ghosts were as real and present to him as she and Samuel were. They were a family of three, living with the memory of three others. The turning point came on a day when the sky was the color of a fresh bruise. Jedediah had been out mending the fence on the far side of his property, a task he usually took his time with, finding a strange peace in the repetitive work. As he returned to the cabin, he noticed something amiss. The small, worn shoes that Samuel always left neatly by the door were gone. He found them later, behind the woodshed, one of them with a sole that had come almost completely detached. The boy had likely been trying to fix it himself, a small, secret act of a child who knew what it was to have nothing. Jedediah picked up the ruined shoes, his heart clenching with a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It was a sharp, protective ache. That night, long after Alara and Samuel were asleep, he sat by the fire, not with a piece of wood to whittle, but with the boy's small shoes in his hands. He took a piece of his own thickest leather, cut it carefully to size, and with an awl and wax thread, he painstakingly stitched new soles onto the worn uppers. His hands, accustomed to the heft of an axe and the pull of reins, moved with surprising delicacy. He worked late into the night, the only sound the hiss of the fire and the steady pull of the thread through leather. He was not just mending a pair of shoes. He was mending something broken inside himself. He placed the repaired shoes back on the porch where Samuel always left them. The next morning, Alara saw them. She stopped in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth. The new soles were thick and sturdy, the stitching strong and even. It was the work of a man who cared. She looked out toward the barn, where Jedediah was already at work, his back to the house. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign she could barely name it. It was gratitude, but it was more than that. It was the first tentative shoot of trust. She didn't mention the shoes, and neither did he. But when she poured his coffee that morning, she let her fingers brush against his for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, but he didn't pull away. Outside, the wind began to pick up, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of a storm that was gathering its strength on the horizon. The air grew heavy, charged with an unspoken tension, a sense that the quiet rhythm of their lives was about to be broken. The storm did not wait for an invitation. It descended upon the plains with a sudden, violent fury, a wild beast of wind and rain. The sky turned a dark, bruised purple, and the world outside the cabin dissolved into a gray, roaring chaos. Rain hammered against the roof and sluiced down the single window pane, blurring the landscape into a formless, churning mass. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, shaking the sturdy log walls until the very timbers seemed to groan in protest. Inside, the fire in the hearth spat and hissed as gusts of wind found their way down the chimney. Alara had pulled Samuel close, her arms a protective circle around him, as they listened to the storm's assault. It was in the midst of this tempest that a new, more terrifying storm began to brew inside the cabin. Samuel, who had been quiet and listless all afternoon, began to shiver, his teeth chattering despite the warmth of the fire and the blanket wrapped around him. Alara touched his forehead. It was burning hot. A raw, primal fear seized her, colder and sharper than the wind outside. She had seen this fever before in the crowded, dirty places they had passed through. She knew how quickly it could steal the life from a small body. She held him tighter, rocking him back and forth, humming a frantic, tuneless lullaby as if the sound alone could ward off the sickness. Her own helplessness was a physical weight, pressing down on her, suffocating her. Jedediah came in from the barn, drenched and breathing hard, just as Samuel began to cry out. His words a jumbled, fevered nonsense. Jedediah took one look at the boy's flushed face and glazed eyes, and the weariness fell away from him, replaced by a focused, urgent energy. He moved with a purpose Alara had never seen in him before. "Get a basin of cool water," he commanded, his voice firm, cutting through the noise of the storm and her rising panic. She scrambled to obey, her hands trembling as she filled a basin from the water barrel. He gently took the boy from her arms. Samuel felt unnervingly light, his body limp with fever. Jedediah laid him on the cot and began to sponge his face and wrists with the cool water, his large, rough hands moving with an astonishing gentleness. "It's the fever," he said, his voice low and steady. "We need to bring it down." For the rest of that night, Jedediah did not leave the boy's side. The storm raged outside, a mirror to the battle being waged within Samuel's small body. Jedediah seemed to know just what to do. He brewed a bitter tea from herbs he kept in a tin box, coaxing the boy to swallow a few sips. He kept the cool cloths on his forehead, changing them tirelessly as they grew warm. He spoke to Samuel in a low, soothing murmur, not words of sense, but sounds of comfort, the same tones he used to calm a frightened horse. Alara watched him, a silent, terrified spectator. She saw not just a man performing a task, but a father. The tenderness in his touch, the deep worry etched into the lines around his eyes. It was the practiced, instinctual care of someone who had done this before. The empty rocking chair in the corner of the room seemed to mock them, a silent monument to a time when his care had not been enough. She realized with a sudden, painful clarity that in tending to her son, he was trying to save his own. Sometime in the deep, dark hours before dawn, with the storm beginning to exhaust itself, Alara could no longer bear her silent vigil. She knelt by the cot, next to Jedediah. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, the confession a painful admission of her own inadequacy. He looked at her, his eyes weary in the flickering lamplight. "You're doing it," he said softly. "You're here." He reached out, not to touch her, but to adjust the blanket around Samuel. The simple, shared act of tucking the boy in was more intimate than any touch. In that moment, her fear did not vanish, but it was no longer a solitary burden. She was not alone in the storm. She stayed there, kneeling on the floor beside him, watching her son breathe, until the first pale, gray light of dawn began to seep through the window, pushing back the darkness. The worst of the storm, both inside and out, had passed. The fever broke with the dawn. One moment, Samuel was tossing restlessly, his skin slick with sweat. The next, he was still, his breathing deep and even, his forehead cool to the touch. A profound, bone-deep relief washed over Alara, so potent it left her weak. She slumped against the edge of the cot, her head bowed, tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed finally tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. Jedediah placed a hand on her shoulder, a brief, solid pressure. "He'll be fine now," he said. "He just needs to rest." The storm outside had dwindled to a steady, gentle rain, washing the world clean. The air in the cabin felt different, scrubbed clean of the sharp edges of fear and suspicion. A quiet sense of shared victory settled over them. Later that morning, with Samuel sleeping peacefully, Alara found Jedediah on the porch, staring out at the rain-soaked landscape. The world looked new. The dust settled, the colors of the prairie grasses deeper and more vibrant. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt small, inadequate for the debt she owed him. He didn't turn around, just nodded toward the horizon. "My wife. She knew about herbs," he said, the words pulled from a deep, painful place. "My son." He was about Samuel's age. The fever came on fast. There was a blizzard. The doctor couldn't get through. He fell silent. The story left unfinished, hanging in the damp air between them. But she understood. She understood the empty rocking chair, the locked chest, the vast, sorrowful silence he carried within him. She had been living in the house of his grief, and now she knew its name. She did not offer words of comfort. She knew there were none that could touch a wound that deep. Instead, she told him a piece of her own story, her voice quiet and steady in the gentle rain. She spoke of a husband whose hands were quick and cruel, of a life of fear and shrinking, of the night she had finally bundled up her son and fled with nothing but the clothes on her back. She spoke of the long road, the hunger, the cold, the men who looked at her with hunger of a different kind. She spoke not to elicit pity, but to be known, to offer her own brokenness as a way of acknowledging his. It was an exchange of truths, a quiet confession on a rain-washed porch. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he went back inside the cabin. He returned a moment later, holding something in his hand. He knelt down beside the still sleeping Samuel and gently placed a small, exquisitely carved wooden horse on the blanket next to him. It was different from the rough one he had given the boy before. This one was older, its wood polished to a soft sheen by the touch of small hands, its painted eyes faded with time. It was a treasure, a relic. It was a memory. This was his, Jedediah said, his voice thick with unshed tears. He was not just giving Samuel a toy. He was giving them a piece of his heart, a piece of the son he had lost. Alara reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the blanket. It was the first time she had initiated contact. He did not pull away. They stayed like that for a long moment, their hands covering the small wooden horse, two solitary survivors finding a fragile, unspoken solace in their shared history of loss. The rain had stopped. A sliver of sun broke through the clouds, casting a pale, hopeful light across the plains. Weeks turned into a month, and the fragile trust forged in the heart of the storm began to solidify. The quiet of the cabin was no longer heavy with suspicion, but comfortable with a shared understanding. However, their sanctuary was an island, and the world beyond the fence line still existed. Their supplies were running low, and a trip to the town of Redemption, a hardscrabble settlement a half-day's ride away, became unavoidable. Jedediah hated the town. It was a place of prying eyes and long memories, a place he had avoided for years. The thought of taking Alara and Samuel there filled him with a low, simmering dread. It felt like leading lambs into a den of wolves. But there was no choice. The ride into town was tense. Samuel sat in front of Jedediah on the saddle, wide-eyed at the vastness of the world beyond the ranch. Alara rode the pack mule, her back straight, her face set in a stoic mask that Jedediah recognized as a shield against fear. As they rode down Redemption's dusty main street, he felt the familiar weight of judgment settle upon him. People stopped to stare at the reclusive rancher with the strange woman and child. Whispers followed them like burrs on a blanket. Jedediah kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his jaw tight. He tied the horses in front of the general store, his movements stiff. "Stay here," he said to Alara, his voice low. "I'll be quick." But the world has a way of finding you no matter how far you run. As Jedediah stepped into the store, a man emerged from the saloon across the street, his swaggering walk a study in cheap arrogance. He was a big man with a florid face and small, cruel eyes. He stopped dead when he saw Alara, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his lips. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Look what the wind blew in. I've been looking for you." Alara froze, the color draining from her face. It was Silas, her husband, a man she had prayed she would never see again. Samuel scrambled behind his mother, his small hands clutching her dress. "You owe me, girl," Silas sneered, stepping closer. "You and the boy. You're my property." He reached out to grab her arm. The townsfolk who had been watching from the doorways and windows now had their entertainment. They gathered to watch the confrontation, their faces a mixture of mild curiosity and cold indifference. No one moved to help. They were spectators at a familiar drama of possession and power. Alara flinched back, pulling Samuel tighter against her. "We're not your property," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "We never were." Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "We'll see about that." Just as his fingers were about to close around her arm, a shadow fell over them. Jedediah stood there, a sack of flour in one hand, his face like thunder. He had seen the commotion from the store's window. He dropped the sack with a heavy thud, sending a puff of white dust into the air. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped between Silas and Alara, his body a solid, immovable wall. Silas, surprised, took a step back. "This ain't your business, rancher," he snarled. "This is between me and my wife." Jedediah looked at Silas, his eyes cold and flat. Then he looked at Alara, at her pale, frightened face, and at the small boy peeking out from behind her skirts. He saw the life they had started to build, the quiet peace of the past month, and he knew he would not let this man destroy it. "She's not your wife," Jedediah said, his voice low and dangerous, a rumbling sound that carried over the whispers of the crowd. "She's with me now." The declaration hung in the dusty air, stark and absolute. It was more than a statement. It was a claim, a shield, a promise. Silas's face contorted with rage. He lunged, but Jedediah was ready. He didn't throw a punch. He simply caught Silas's arm, his grip like iron. He twisted, using the man's own momentum to spin him around and shove him back toward the saloon. Silas stumbled, catching himself on the hitching post, his arrogance deflating into stunned humiliation. "Get out of my town," Jedediah said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Silas glared at him, then at Alara, his eyes full of venom. But he saw the set of Jedediah's jaw and the cold resolve in his eyes, and he saw that this was a fight he could not win. With a final curse, he turned and disappeared back into the saloon. The street was silent. The townsfolk stared, their curiosity now mixed with a grudging respect. Jedediah ignored them. He turned to Alara. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. She could only nod, her hand still pressed to her mouth. He then did something that shocked the entire town. He walked back into the general store, and when he came out, he was carrying a new coat, a deep blue wool, sturdy and warm. He walked over to Alara and gently draped it over her thin shoulders. It was a public act of protection, a symbol for all to see. He was clothing her, claiming her, sheltering her from the cold world. He helped her onto the mule, lifted Samuel back into his own saddle, and without a backward glance at the town of redemption, they started for home. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the silence had changed again. It was no longer a space of caution or comfortable understanding. It was now filled with the reverberations of what had happened in town. Jedediah's public declaration, "She's with me now," echoed in Alara's mind. It had been an act of pure protection, a shield he had raised without hesitation. The new blue coat felt heavy on her shoulders, a weight of gratitude and a dawning, terrifying hope. She looked at the man's broad, steady back as he rode ahead of her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future. Not just a temporary shelter, but a home, a place to finally stop running. When they arrived back at the cabin, the familiar sight of it nestled in the small valley felt like a true homecoming. It was a sanctuary, a fortress they had successfully defended. The tension of the day slowly began to drain away, replaced by a deep sense of peace. That evening, as Alara prepared their meal, her movements were different. The caution was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. She belonged here. She was safe here. Jedediah watched her, feeling a sense of rightness settle deep in his bones. The cabin, which for so long had been a hollow vessel for his grief, now felt full. It was alive with the soft sounds of a woman humming, a child playing, a fire crackling. It was a home again. The days that followed saw a subtle but profound shift in their lives. Samuel, sensing the new security, blossomed. The wary, silent child was replaced by a boy full of questions and laughter. He began to follow Jedediah to the barn, his small legs pumping to keep up with the man's long strides. He would help by carrying a single piece of firewood or by holding a bucket, his face a mask of serious concentration. Jedediah, to his own surprise, found he didn't mind the small shadow. He started talking to the boy, explaining the names of the tools, showing him how to groom a horse, telling him which clouds meant rain. He was teaching the boy the things he had once imagined teaching his own son. One afternoon, Samuel came into the cabin, his hands proudly clutching a piece of paper he had found and a nub of charcoal from the hearth. He sat at the table, tongue sticking out in concentration, and drew. When he was finished, he shyly presented the drawing to Jedediah. It was a child's simple, powerful art. A square house with a triangle roof, smoke curling from the chimney. And in front of the house stood 3 figures. A tall man in a hat, a woman in a long dress, and a small boy standing between them, holding both their hands. Above them all, a bright, smiling sun filled the corner of the page. Jedediah stared at the drawing, his throat tight. It was a picture of a family. His family. He took the drawing with a reverence that made the flimsy paper feel like a sacred text. He walked over to the stone mantelpiece above the hearth, a space that had been empty for 5 long years. He carefully tacked the drawing to the wall right in the center. It was the first picture, the first personal object, to adorn his house since the tragedy. It was a declaration of a new life, a new beginning, placed at the very heart of their home. Alara watched him, her own eyes shining, and knew that they were no longer just 3 strangers sharing a roof. They were building something real, something to last. The seasons turned, bleeding one into the next. The vibrant green of the rain-washed spring gave way to the long, hot days of summer, then mellowed into the golden, crisp air of autumn. The routine of their lives became a comfortable, enduring rhythm, as reliable as the rising and setting of the sun. Jedediah worked the ranch, his movements infused with a new purpose. He wasn't just maintaining a place to exist. He was building a future. He repaired the porch steps, built a new chicken coop, and planted a small vegetable garden near the cabin for Alara. Alara, in turn, made the house a true home. She put up simple curtains, planted wildflowers in tins along the windowsill, and filled the air with the scent of baking bread and simmering stew. The blue coat Jedediah had bought her in town now hung permanently on a peg by the door, a silent reminder of the day everything changed. Their conversations remained sparse, but the silence between them was rich and full of meaning. A shared look across the dinner table, a small smile as they watched Samuel chase butterflies in the yard, the comfortable quiet of the evenings, sitting by the fire. He would whittle, his knife turning a block of wood into a bird or a wolf for Samuel. She would mend clothes, her needle moving in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Sometimes, she would sit in the small wooden rocking chair. The first time she did, Jedediah had frozen, his breath catching in his chest. But as he watched her rock gently, her expression serene in the firelight, the pain associated with the chair began to recede. It was no longer just a monument to what he had lost. It was now a part of what he had found. The gentle creak of the rocker became a sound of peace, a sound of life continuing, a sound of healing. The ghosts never left entirely. There were still moments when a shadow would cross Jedediah's face, a memory of a different child's laughter, a different woman's touch. And there were nights when Alara would wake from a dream of Silas's cruel hands, her heart pounding with an old fear. But they were no longer alone with their demons. They had each other. They had the solid, tangible reality of their shared life to anchor them in the present. They had Samuel's bright, innocent presence, a constant reminder of the goodness that could still exist in a harsh world. He was the living, breathing proof of their redemption. He had started, tentatively at first, to call Jedediah Pa the first time he said it. Jedediah had felt a jolt, as if his heart, long dormant, had suddenly been shocked back into rhythm. He had simply knelt down and pulled the boy into a rough, heartfelt hug. One evening, as the first snowflakes of winter began to drift down outside the window, the 3 of them sat by the fire. Samuel was asleep on the hearth rug, his small chest rising and falling peacefully, the carved wooden horse clutched in his hand. Alara was in the rocking chair, her mending resting in her lap, her eyes on the flames. Jedediah sat in his usual chair, watching her. He thought of the woman who had appeared at his door less than a year ago, a desperate, half-starved creature braced against the wind. He looked at her now, at the quiet strength in her face, the gentle peace in her eyes. He thought of the man he had been, a hollow shell of a man, waiting for his own life to end. And he felt a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. From silence had come warmth. From emptiness, a home. From the deepest grief, a reason to live again. The quiet life they had built was more precious than any fortune, stronger than any storm. The winter settled in, blanketing the plains in a deep, silent layer of white. The world outside grew cold and still, but inside the cabin, there was a steady, quiet warmth. One night, a blizzard descended, much like the one that had stolen his first family from him. The wind howled and screamed, rattling the windows and piling snow against the door. But this time it was different. This time he was not alone. The three of them were safe inside, cocooned in the warmth of the fire and of each other. Samuel slept soundly, unafraid of the storm's fury. Alara looked up from her seat in the rocker, her gaze meeting Jedediah's across the small space. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, abiding trust. Jedediah rose from his chair and walked to the window, peering out into the swirling maelstrom of white. He felt the old memories stir, the phantom chill of that other, terrible night. He felt a hand on his arm. Alara was standing beside him. She didn't speak. She simply stood with him, her presence a solid, comforting anchor against the pull of the past. He turned from the window and looked down at her. The firelight softened the lines of her face, illuminating the quiet strength and gentle kindness that had healed him. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his calloused thumb stroking her soft skin. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a culmination of 1,000 unspoken words. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief moment. He came in from the cold of the barn, stomping the snow from his boots on the porch. The air inside the cabin was warm, thick with the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke. He hung his hat on its peg, next to the familiar blue coat that had become a permanent fixture by the door. Samuel ran to him, wrapping his small arms around his legs in a fierce hug. "Bah! Mama's making stew." Jedediah ruffled the boy's hair, a real, genuine smile touching his lips. He looked across the room. Alara was standing by the hearth, a ladle in her hand, watching them. She gave him a small, true smile, a smile that reached her eyes and spoke of a deep and settled happiness. He walked over to the fire to warm his hands. She was sitting in the rocker now, gently stirring the pot. He came and stood behind her, placing his large hand on the smooth, worn wood of the chair's back, his fingers brushing against her shoulder. She stopped stirring. Slowly, she reached up with her free hand and covered his hand with her own, her fingers lacing through his. Her touch was warm, certain. She stayed.